Okay, in this section, as you can see, one of the things we looked at in the chapter, that being chapter 5, the author goes on and talks about these different types of transports that we put up on the board the last couple days. It is quite a short section to where we will be having probably a vocab quiz on Tuesday, or no, excuse me, Thursday, because that's when the vocab will be due. We had discussed that. And we'll have some papers for you to work on Tuesday, just on account of we have a couple cross-country meets, one on Tuesday and one on Thursday. But anyway, the different types of transport across the cellular membrane we talked about is diffusion, osmosis, and facilitated diffusion. And those three have this in common. They do not require any energy. It's the active transport that will require energy. And we had discussed that the idea that the first three, osmosis, facilitated diffusion, and regular diffusion, move down what we call a concentration gradient, and that's why it doesn't require any energy. It's the active transport that actively pumps 2 potassium ions out of the cell, while 3 sodium ions are allowed to come into the cellular membrane, and that's why it requires energy. Okay, so the simplest, again, that is diffusion. It's the simplest of all the transports, and it moves small molecules like that of blood gases. That would be the best way to look what diffusion deals with, is movement of oxygen in, carbon dioxide out for that of animals, and then of course it's just the opposite for that of plants. The oxygen goes out, carbon dioxide goes in. Okay, so there we see that term concentration gradient, that we see where area of substance goes from high to low is the best way to look at that. Okay, and again, we talked about that would be blood gases would be an example of moving materials across that membrane. And then as you can see, this would occur until you reach the same equilibrium where the gradient would be the same inside as it is out. And one of the examples we also talked about in class was that of the lock and key mechanism in moving ships through the Panama Canal. You will float water or pump water into the lock until it raises to the same level concentration of the next lock, so that you can open up, and that's how you could move a ship in this essence, either uphill or downhill. That equilibrium has to be reached until the diffusion would stop them. All right. Then the next type of movement, which is going to be that of water in this process of osmosis, is very similar to that of diffusion in that it's a net movement of water down a concentration gradient. There again, that will continue until you see what we have here is an isotonic solution, where it will be the same inside and that of outside of the cell. Okay, so diffusion, simple molecules like blood gases into and out of the cell through the cell membrane. Goes from an area of high concentration to low concentration, and that is a concentration gradient. Osmosis is the similar process, but it's water instead of blood gases. And an example we gave with this hypotonic solution, solutes are higher inside the cell, water is forced in. But one of the examples we gave is if you were stranded out in seawater where we talked about water all around but not a drop to drink. The idea that if there was only salt water, you would not want to drink that salt water, because what happens is, notice the solute molecules are higher outside of the cell. It should say not he, be outside of the cell. Water would then be forced out because it wants to make the same concentration of water with these solutes. But if you're drinking all of this salt water, you're going to have a higher concentration of that salt, okay, on the outside of your cells as opposed to inside. Therefore, you're forcing this water out, okay? And when it does that, that will continue until the cell, it will die. And should that happen long enough, that can be fatal for someone that could succumb to that, and that is having too much salt in their body. Okay? So diffusion and osmosis. Then we see facilitated diffusion. All right? And in this case, it's materials that are much too large to go into and out of the cell by just moving across. Here we see carrier proteins are utilized. Okay, glucose is an example. Proteins would be an example of movement across this membrane. There's also a concentration gradient of high to low, and what it has in common with diffusion and osmosis is that two things. One, there's a concentration gradient movement of high to low, and because of that, it does not require any energy. So diffusion, osmosis, facilitated diffusion, and here we see a little more elaboration in that of facilitated diffusion, and we leave off with active transport. As you can see, since with active transport, if it's movement against a concentration gradient, it will therefore require energy then. Okay, so that's how active transport is, let's say, different than that of the other three. Okay. Oops. Okay. And we'll elaborate a little further with this next week. I believe that on Monday you'll be working on your skits, either 7th and maybe going into 8th hour. Okay, so that's Monday. And then on Tuesday, I believe I'll have some papers handed out for you for Chapter 5, because again, we have a cross-country meet in Garrettson. And then, as you can see, Wednesday, you'll be participating in dodgeball at this time on Wednesday. So then Thursday, your vocab is due, and we'll have a vocab quiz over Chapter 5 at that time. Okay, so we will catch up to you next time.